All right, we're live. Welcome to episode 94 of the Card Diary by Hobbyist Thompson. I am your host, Danny Cards, and today, nothing against my previous guest, but this is my favorite guest that I get to have on my podcast. Like a year and a half ago, I didn't even have this podcast. I didn't even have. I met the guy. I met the guy last year at National, and when you see the title of the episode, you'll know that I have GemRate Ryan from GemRate on. I continue to be amazed by the people who are willing to accept my invitation to come onto the podcast. Ryan is the most frequent guest. I couldn't remember whether it's the fourth or fifth time, but he's definitely been on 3 times. I would love to have him on a monthly basis, but also I can't keep, asking him to come on for his time all the time. But every month, if you don't know, on Instagram, GemRate, they provide a monthly breakdown, and they do it like a month over month and year over year as to how the grading companies are doing on a monthly basis, which is information that they provide him, and I think is publicly available. But Ryan also has a website, gemrate.com. This is not sponsored content. I just feel like I have to say that because some people ask me and like, why do you talk about these people and that people? I'm like, get off my case. I'm just doing what I want to do. But Ryan is a really good dude, and thank you for coming on to the podcast, Ryan.
Thanks, Danny. Appreciate it. Always a pleasure. You always sort of go into different territories, which is what I always appreciate too. So it's always fun showing up and having a good conversation.
Thank you. I'm just a very curious person. I'm like just naturally curious. And some people hate that because they don't want me to be curious. They just want to be like, just do what you're told or do what you're, like just believe what we say all the time. And I'm like, well, why? I think that's the best question is why. So for this particular episode, for the people who are watching on YouTube, we are still going to try to do our best to, provide an audio only experience, but we do have up on YouTube the charts that he has. These are not the charts that you provide on Instagram. These are like, this is where you get the raw data to put into your charts. Actually, I see a little screen share. I see that you have the top 50 graded athletes. You actually did screen grab that and put that onto Instagram, right?
Yep. Yeah. So some of these, about half of what I have, well, about 25% of what I have on the screen here is what was on Instagram, and then the rest of it's additional stuff.
Yes.
Either inspired it or is in addition or was part of the previous post that I did in July, but I just didn't share any updates on it.
Gotcha. Okay. So for the YouTube audience, you will see on your screen, again, if you want to go to GemRate on Instagram or again, gemrate.com, this information will be readily available. And I wanted to say the title of this episode is going to be Wemby Wemby Wemby. That is a play on the Brady Bunch, Marsha, because it is the beginning of the basketball season. And the thing that really popped out, and I told myself I gotta have Ryan back on, is he recently made a post about how Victor Wembanyama, and he didn't provide this opinionated section. This is where I'm going to put a little color. 1 year, or maybe 1+ year, because you got Topps Inception, Bowman Inception, all that, like draft picks, Prism draft picks. But with 1 year of rookie cards, Victor Wembanyama is now the 15th most graded athlete of all time. Just 1 year. Again, 1 year plus, like let's say 2 years. He's at 430,000. We have Michael Jordan up at the top with 2.1 million, 2.12 million. And we're talking about decades of his cards. Again, just for audio purposes, I'm just going to go down just the top 5. I'm not going to say all the names. But you got Ken Griffey Jr. at 1.06 million. Those are the only 2 athletes over $1 million mark. Again, top 50 graded athletes of all time. And this is just PSA, or is this all the grading companies?
All grading companies.
All grading companies. Then third, you have LeBron James. Then you have Kobe Bryant, and then you have Shohei Ohtani. You don't even get to football until 8th place, which is Tom Brady at 534,000. Again, I'm not going to say all the numbers and all the athletes. This is just a cornucopia of data. It's not just this chart. There's so many data analytics that Ryan provides for the hobby, for the free, as the breakers like to say, for the free. And so, again, thank you. Let's dive into I'm going to give you the floor to just talk about this just meteoric rise of Victor Wembanyama.
Yeah, by the way, I should clarify. I said all graders, but it's the main 4, just so people don't assume there's other graders here. So just PSA, Beckett, SGC, and CGC are included in this.
Okay.
And
gotcha.
one of the reasons this does pretty well is it's just really hard to sort of accumulate or sort of combine the data across the grading companies. PSA has become more open and willing to sort of share updates. They recently had a post about how Wembanyama was like the most graded athlete over the last few months and things like that. So I'm glad to see that there's more data coming out on this front. I think it's really productive for the hobby just to understand like broader trends. And so this is just the post I did. I had a national, did really well. People were really excited. It's just the first time that list had sort of ever been seen publicly, which was just like partially just like bringing awareness to like, okay, this is where everybody ranks, but also there's always surprises. People are surprised to see people like Luis Robert is on the top 50 or like, just where like some of the certain athletes surprise people where like Burrow and Herbert are ahead of certain all-time greats. Like Stephen Curry is number 30 on this list. And people are really surprised when they see him so low, given how, game-changing he's been and sort of iconic and, just really is appreciated in the hobby. But for me, the most interesting thing, obviously, is Wembanyama moving up to 15th. I mean, the 430,000 cards is sort of just a jarring number. I have additionally on the screen, I didn't share this yet publicly, but just sort of the Wembanyama cards graded by month across all the graders. And the National was actually, the month of the National, so July was his biggest month. I didn't even have full data for this at the time I did the July post, but 58,000 cards were graded of his just in July alone, which is kind of stunning. And he still maintained a lot of that momentum. October data is not even complete here in this data that I'm showing. It's still missing a week's worth of data. He'll probably do close to 50,000 in October, but he's been doing roughly 45 to 50,000 every month since then too. And ultimately, he's going to pass 500,000, 500,000 cards before the year's over. He's got a real chance within the next, 8 months of making that top 5 and potentially even. I mean, I actually have some Shohei data that I brought to this conversation too, just to sort of highlight. Shohei's also had sort of a pretty rare and unique run in the hobby over the last few years. Wemby's last 6 months have been higher than Shohei's highest month, just to give you some context. Like he's just been sort of in uncharted territory, and it's been really interesting to see. There's a lot of questions around like why and how sustainable it is, but Shohei obviously is sort of more established, and so it's interesting to think about somebody who is on a path to a very iconic and sort of differentiated career, one that we've never seen before arguably. And there's going to be a lot of defending and a lot of question marks as far as like what Wemby will need to do to sort of stay on that pace as well to sort of warrant all the grading activity that's been happening. And so it's been fascinating to see that he moved from 24th to 15th in 3 months. 50,000 cards a month are being graded across all the graders. He's going to be, he literally within the next month and a half, he's going to be 6th on that list. It's just that Shohei there's a decent gap to get him into the top 5, and that's Shohei. And so he won't be there for a half a year or more, but it's just been a massive rise, and people are really intrigued by it. And the moment I post this, you see a lot of people start to talk about and raise the questions, which is fair. Of okay, is this the junk slab era, and does this define sort of where we're at? And then a lot of people will look back to the 2019. One of the things people point to on this list too is just like, look how high Zion is on this list. Look how high Ja is on this list. Like, are we back in the 2020 cycle? And is it just sort of a different player that's sort of at the front of the story? But are we sort of going through some of the same behaviors? And so a lot of good questions, a lot of good discussion comes up as a part of this. Wemby does sort of challenge a lot of our hobby norms, which is going to be interesting to sort of keep an eye on. And I'm excited for it. Basketball, the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it back over to you, is just basketball was really suffering until Wemby's cards became available. Like it was sort of the poster child of the hype cycle of the pandemic rise. And then it had a massive sort of compression of activity. It just really took a hit and saw a big decline after when the rookie classes really suffered. 2021 was okay. The Apollo class didn't do really well. Chet was hurt. And so they really just saw a ton of activity from basketball decline. And baseball in the meantime had really picked up. Football's always kind of stayed pretty steady actually. So it's been interesting to see. So anyways, basketball has really helped the grading companies in the past few months, and Victor's obviously at the center of that.
I mean, yeah, so the grading companies were helped, the breaking companies were helped. I mean, I can't even imagine the number of basketball breakers that were just absolutely saved by, this the savior of Wemby, and that's why the title of this episode is called Wemby Wemby Wemby. Having said that, and you were talking about baseball, I just wanted to briefly mention a couple of things, and thank you for that breakdown. So Lou Bob, on this particular chart, you have him 30, well, not you have him 30, this is not your personal rankings. The data shows that he is the 33rd most graded athlete of all time among the top 4 grading companies. He is at 236,000, I
Yeah.
think.
Yep.
And then
Yep.
Tiger Woods. I know. I mean, I know he's one of the most popular athletes in the entire world of all time. But I guess his cards don't reflect that, and he doesn't have many cards. And I don't know his whole card population and all that. But he's 34th. He's right below Lou Bob, which is such a funny list. In what lists other than grading could Lou Bob be above Tiger Woods? But here we are. Tiger Woods is 230. 226,000. And then I see CJ Stroud at 31st with 249,000. Again, that's with just 1 year of cards.
Mm-hmm.
Again, minus any draft pick stuff and kind of like pre-rookie card type of thing. Having said that, I want to share with you just a little bit of opinion or a little bit of like non sequitur, which is people have accused me so many times of being a clout chaser. Let me tell you why I'm not. I love basketball. I am not in love with baseball. I dabble in baseball. My main 3 sports ranked wise is basketball, football, and then baseball. If I wanted to chase clout, I would only talk about baseball cards and Pokemon cards. I would actually leave the entire sports card industry, the whole content creation and all that. I would move my entire content over to Pokemon because it is such a big market. And right now, we're only going to talk about sports. We're going to mainly talk about Wemby. But when you do your GemRate data, Pokemon, I mean PSA is grading like over 1 million cards per month. We think that sports cards, because we're in the sports card hobby, we keep thinking, oh, that's 1 million sports cards. No, not the overwhelming majority of Pokemon, but a decent size of that is Pokemon cards and TCG. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we hear about One Piece and we hear about Magic the Gathering. Like, we think that we're so big in the hobby, but our total addressable market is actually quite small.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating. The TCG thing in general has just been kind of crazy to watch. It's a little one that's a little bit harder for me to understand because I'm just not as active in that space, but I'm trying to sort of continue to pay attention and be able to contextualize things. But yeah, TCG's been nuts. Pokemon, I mean, it's hard to know sort of how much of it again, how much of it's sustainable. Are they just a couple of years behind what's happening with TCG versus what happened in sports cards? And like, they have seen some decline, but they've also seen some alternatives show up. Like One Piece is doing really well. Like that's actually been carrying a ton of momentum for TCG. Like it's very interesting to watch, fascinating because again, it is so concentrated with sports cards. The thing like we're talking about, like you were mentioning Lou Bob versus Tiger Woods. Tiger Woods doesn't have that many cards, so for him to have 226,000 cards graded actually means that there's like a few cards with a lot of cards graded. And with Lou Bob, he was sort of thriving in the middle of the print runs increasing, and so he's got 236,000 cards graded across many thousands and thousands of cards. And so with Pokemon, it's much more concentrated. You see just a few characters that do really well. I mean, there's hundreds of characters that do well, but there's a few that really drive a lot of the momentum, and there's a lot of cards that shouldn't say a lot, but there's a much smaller number of cards that do really well. What's interesting though is how many of them get graded and actually still sell at like a reasonable price. I mean, it's not a high margin category, but it's a very productive one. And the reality is a lot of people collect them, and that helps. That makes it worth the while. It's not as flipping centric. I mean, there are obviously moments where that happens there, and like there are certainly big players in there that are focused on that, but there are a lot of collectors there, which helps the TCG market, persist in a way that's a little bit different than what we see in sports.
I mean, it's all about entertainment, right? I mean, for sports, the episodes or the seasons or the of the show is the seasons of the sports. The episodes are like the games, right? And then you have these actual streaming, series where you have like One Piece, when it comes out on Netflix, then people
Mm-hmm.
consume it. They want to have a physical representation of that thing, and then that's totally taken aside the playing game aspect, right? Because once you're playing games, no one is actually playing with slaps. I actually ask people like, what do you do with these cards? Like, because they're supposed to be playing card, and they're like, no, we don't play with these. There's actually like different categories, like LP for lightly played, MP for medium played, and HP for highly played, and they're like worn corners and all that because that's what they use in tournaments. So it's funny because, I mean, when I've seen like alt, they come out with like their risers and fallers, and I see Monkey D. Luffy, and I'm like, what? Why is Monkey D. Luffy on the rise? What did he do? There's no game for him to score 4 touchdowns, but he's on the list. And then for fallers, like, again, I don't know why, like, it's not like Charizard can, like, break an ankle, is what we usually like to say in the hobby, right? But it is interesting to see, like you said, like, I think the margins, I think when I see PSA 10s, and again, we're gonna get back to Wemby, but when I see these Japanese Pokemon cards being graded, I mean, I've seen so many PSA 10s, and I think maybe you can help us a little bit with the data, because I know we're kind of going off a little off track here from basketball, but when it comes to the gem rate of Japanese Pokemon cards, they are higher. I mean, they have rounded corners. The print qualities are less. There's less print lines. There's like no surface dimples that I've seen. Sometimes things can be miscut or misprinted, like kind of like off-centered. But for the most part, I feel like they keep churning out, like, international printing companies just keep churning out Gem Mint fresh out the pack cards. Whereas, you open up a pack of Panini Prism and you're like praying that the best card is going to be centered well with no surface dimples, no print lines, and no edge issues.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I mean, you do see, I mean, the sort of one of the lesser known or understood stories in the hobby is sort of like, Beckett obviously gets a lot of commentary just around, like, you could call it the decline, but just sort of like their lack of enthusiasm, or sort of really just their lack of publicity. They're just really not that public in what they're doing and how they're doing it. But like, one of the things that's helped them continue to move forward is a lot of what you're speaking to, the Japanese Pokemon and the cards with basically really good quality control are graded a lot by Beckett, because people know that a differentiator is a black label as opposed to a 10, because everything grades so highly. It's not unusual for those cards to grade at a 90% gem rate, which is unheard of for most sports cards. And so what people do is they try to find hot ways to level up, and a lot of those cards go to Beckett. Similar to sports, what happens in sports, which nobody really talks about, is Topps now is getting graded like crazy, and it's not really well understood. It's not really as highly collected, so it doesn't get discussed as much. But people have sort of, I don't know how large the players are in the space, but there's a certain, cohort in the hobby that's just grading a ton of Topps Now cards, and it's because they grade so well. And again, that's another area that Beckett sort of differentiates itself, because people want the black labels, knowing that they're such high quality. Because if you look at Topps Now cards, I think Wemby even on this list here had a couple, or at least one of them. Like, let's see what Wemby's Topps Now card was. Yeah, 91% gem rate for his Topps Now card, which is like far higher than, and then 90% for his other card on this list. The next highest is Select with an 81, and then the rest of them are like, anywhere from 40 to 70%. But anyways, Topps Now really does stand out from a quality standpoint. And so it's just fascinating to sort of understand, like, these nuances in the hobby, which are really not well known, which is part of the reason I love bringing this data to the market, because it just sort of helps provide context around why people might be doing what they're doing. Ultimately, a lot of what I do is about narratives. It helps people who do believe in Topps Now tell a little bit better story when they want to. People might call it hyping, but the reality is you collect things for a reason. And to your point earlier, like, a lot of what we do is because of hype or identity, or sort of like ways that we associate with the players, or sort of the cards we collect. And the better the data out there, I believe, the better the stories that can be told. And so anyways, it's just really interesting. TCG's been a space that's really eaten up a lot of the data that we've been publishing, because it's helped people contextualize what's happening there. But a lot of it's still not really understood. And so I wish I could do more, but just doing like this Wemby report is one example of where we can kind of just help contextualize things a little bit more than sort of is generally understood.
No, absolutely. Well said. I feel like you should be the host. I just want you to be the host for my entire podcast, because you did a great segue into what I wanted to do, which was about the top graded cards about Wemby. I'm looking at this list again, just to kind of help out the audio a little, the folks on the audio a little bit. You have 91% of all of Victor Wembanyama's 2023 Topps Now, number 472, having a 91% gem rate. And the recent PSA 10 price of that is $35. So if you buy it for like $5, if you buy 20 of them, buy for $5, you're graded for about, let's say, 20. the margin is small. Like, you know, like you're into the card for like $25, but if you can get a PSA 10, you flip it for 35. Got minus the eBay fees if you do sell it on eBay. You know, different if you sell it at a show or like maybe trade value. But you're looking at maybe like, you know, $8-10. Well, I would say, yeah, $6 to $8 on a $25 investment, if you want to call it that. So, you know, rough numbers. We're talking maybe like a 20% margin. Again, if you just do that over and over and over again, I mean, like some people, that's a play that I've heard is just great to flip the printed demand cards because they grade so well. Oh, I'm sorry, $40.
No. I'm bringing it up because I was wondering how much that's changed since July. Because one of the things that people don't
July.
realize too is that's the current price, right? Now that the supply is much better known, you know, 35 is sort of what's happened once all these cards started at the market. But there was probably a period in time where people were selling those for $100, or at least like
that's
$35,
true.
right?
That's true. Yeah.
Like, you know, there's moments that you can sort of capitalize on these things. The challenge is you need people to collect these things at the end of the day. But there are definitely moments where, like, this was a card that, again, people could showcase that, hey, I'm into Victor. I'm interested in what he's doing. I'm grading a lot of them, or I'm collecting them, or I'm holding on to them, at least for now. And this was before any of the Panini stuff had really hit the market. And so, anyways, it's really interesting to think about where people go in this hobby and why they do it. And Topps Now has been an area where people are like, I'm looking at it right now with football, like with Jaden Daniels. He doesn't anything in the market, but people are grading his Topps Now cards just came out, and people are grading those like a ton because it's the only thing people could even do to sort of highlight that they've collected what he's doing, or that they have that available to people who are looking to invest or sort of interested in collecting what Jaden Daniels is doing. So it's just interesting to watch. The Topps Now is like a poster child of like, it grades really well. There's not a high margin there, but you know, if you do it at the appropriate volume and you find the right place to sell it and you do it early enough, you can make money. That matters.
Yeah. No, I think that's fantastic. Right behind it at 90% gem rate, you have his other Topps Now. It's 2023 Topps Now Draft D1, and that has a 90% gem rate. And that current PSA price at PSA 10 is $40. I think you have the other chart up. How much was it going for in July? 40 $40. And but that at that time it was the second highest, most graded card of Wemby. It looks like.
Yeah.
And then you have the I mean, the Prism one's going to be graded the most amongst. Would you say like basically virtually all athletes for Ultra Modern, like their Panini Prism rookie card is going to be the most graded card of any athlete?
Yeah, I would say so. Generally speaking, that's what
Generally, yeah.
I mean, he had the wild card of the Monopoly card that was doing really well for a while, but yeah, I mean, almost certainly for this Panini era, that's usually where it
the
goes.
Panini era, right? And then in a year or two, we'll switch over to the Topps Chrome base or whatever.
I actually did one quick thing too, which I'll show you, which just in anticipation of this conversation was I went through and just was looking at his sort of like top 50 cards. And I was actually just trying to see like what set they were from. And, you know, 15 of his top 50 cards are Panini Prism brand. Wow. Not all Panini Prism core. There's Monopoly in there. There's draft picks. But 15 of the top 50 are Panini Prism. Then 9 of the next 50 are, the next closest is Select. And then you kind of get into some of the, like, you know, Don Ross is up there. Hoops is up there. And you get other sort of. Now it's got a couple in there. But anyways, Prism dominates. It's just, it moves. Yeah. It grades decent enough. And there's the challenge with Panini in general, and this is something they've done well, but it's probably long-term not really great for the hobby, but like will benefit people 20 years from now, is that there's a lot of parallels that people grade because they think they're going to be worthwhile, but they don't necessarily sort of hold up over time. You know, of the 90 parallels that they have available, maybe only 10 of them are going to matter, right? But currently people will buy a lot of, you know, Victor's greens and Victor's, you know, whatever, his ice and all these other things. Those may not sort of stand the test of time, but, you know, but Prism has a lot of those to grade. You know, they've got enough parallels that aren't numbered that people will grade a lot of, especially with somebody like Victor.
Oh yes, like you said, these have to go to end collector because I think there is a little bit of a bubble. That's just my opinion, but I think that there's a lot of passing, you know, the hot potato type of thing, and he is hot. Him, C.J. Stroud, and Jaden Daniels, all that. I did want to say out of the 15 Prism cards, and you don't have to pull it up because I saw, but we were just talking about parallels, but there's also the inserts, right? So I saw Deep Space, I saw Impact, I saw Instant Impact, I'm sorry, Emergent, Global Reach. So these are the Panini Prism inserts that get graded. And so, you know, when you say 15 out of the 50 are Panini Prism, I just wanted to provide a little color to folks who maybe are, you know, only listening on audio. But that's what we're seeing here. And the green, the darker the green on your screen is GemRate. So, things that stand out to me is that his Donruss base has a really low GemRate of 26%.
Yep.
A really low one is Donruss Green Hollow Laser at 19%.
Right.
11% Donruss the rookie. So basically, don't grade Donruss anything or Wemby or anything. And then the tops now for sure. And then the Panini Prism is around the 50 to 60%. It looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I like to think, at least the way that I sort of participate in the hobby, is I do like things like Don Roston, which have like these really low gem rates, to think that maybe at the end of the day, it'll be harder to find a nice PSA 10 in the market, or a gem. This is across all graders here. So some sort of gem mint version of that card.
Yeah.
And so like, the green laser only has it, if I were to resort this by the actual gems, they're going to be significantly lower on this list, just because it's much harder to find a good high quality version of those cards. And I'd like to think over time, some of those things might stand out or sort of make people more interested in paying the premium for those cards, or at least like work harder to find those cards. But who knows? There's so many options. That's sort of what I was speaking to before with like Prism and all these things. There's so many unknowns, which is why the hobby gets so much participation, because there's no clear path. There's no playbook for a lot of what we're seeing at this stage. And so it allows a lot of people to participate with their own sort of opinions and sort of where they think things will go. And it really is fascinating to watch. And there's just so much data and so much noise ultimately right now.
Isn't it so much more fun to watch when you don't have as much skin in the game, right? Like if you're like someone who's holding on to tens or hundred thousands of dollars worth of Wemby, it's got to be stressful. But for you and I who dabble or like have a little bit of like a taste, like for example, I have my most expensive Wemby is the Panini Silver PSA 10, and I got that in a trade with Jeff Wilson, which was polarizing. People either liked it or didn't, but I traded him I forget what year, but like say 2022 Donruss Optic Josh Allen Downtown PSA 10 that I graded myself. So I was already high on the card. I was already winning on the card because I graded a PSA 10, and I traded it almost straight up with a little bit extra cash that he gave me because I beat him in a coin flip. And I'm not saying all that just to be like I beat Jeff Wilson in a coin flip, but maybe I am. But when it comes down to it, the valuation that he and I put on the Wemby was about $1,000, and I thought to myself, I gotta hold on to this because the trade happened in Fanatics Fest, like a trade night at Bleecker Trading, and so that was about 2 months ago. And I was like, I want to hold on to this card until basketball season is about to start, because there should be a little bit of an uptick in his prices for me to maybe get a little bit extra on this card as opposed to flipping it like a week or two after getting it. And I also have like sentimental value, not just because it's like Jeff Wilson trade, but also like it's my one Wemby card where, again, this is like a physical representation of me kind of like liking his very uniqueness. I'm not a big Spurs fan. I'm not a big Wemby fan, but I'm just like, this is his benchmark or hallmark card of all of his cards, and I have one. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is right now you have it valued at 850, so it's dropped in value. Again, October and November, like let's say if he plays a little bit better, or if he starts off the season really well, his prices could go up. But then I guess what I'm saying is, as basketball season was coming little by little, more of his cards are coming into the pop count in PSA 10, and people are finding it to be less rare. Like you said, we're talking about the tops now. People may have been selling for $100 like 3-4 months ago, but now it's at $40. Not because of him doing anything bad. It's just that the pop count just keeps rising and rising daily.
Totally. No, I mean, the silver is a really interesting discussion, and I won't go too deep into it. But I mean, in general, that's sort of like one of the most misunderstood components of the hobby, which is dilution, and the idea that there's just more options that get brought to market, right? And so like the Wemby's market's been going up. I mean, it's pretty well understood. If you were to add up all the money spent on Wemby over the last few months, it's been pretty strong. However, some of his more significant cards or more liquid cards have gone down just because there continues to be more options for you to invest in it. So that's what makes cards tricky, is you can make a good call as it relates to an athlete, but you have to sort of like think about the short term. Like one of the reasons silver is really interesting is because it does really well in the near term and the long term. Like it's a very liquid card, a very well understood card. It's significant in that it exists over every Prism version that's ever been released and has been well understood, right? Versus like every other parallel that's been introduced, with few exceptions. And so, it's one that people genuinely believe will still be highly sought after, like a refractor was for, Topps back in the 90s, right? And so, there's a belief, but you have to be willing to sort of like, you have to kind of know what your motivations are and sort of your time frame. And like, that 850 might not feel great today, but if you're willing to sit on it throughout the season and he starts to make a run at, being first team All NBA or something like that, or moving the Spurs into sort of some sort of contention, that card's going to move for sure, because that's going to be one that's going to move more frequently than a lot of other cards that exist in the market, and you'll start to see that price move. But ultimately, you're betting. I mean, if you're collecting silvers, you're kind of betting on that being a card that matters, 15, 20 years down the line, where like his green probably is not going to matter from Prism.
Right. Yeah, I know there's some people who collect multiples of one card, almost in a way too. It's almost like an asset class to them, and I really don't like using that word for cards, but I know that it's used, and we definitely have finance bros in our space. No offense to the finance bros, but also maybe you and the real estate bros. Shout out to all of you. You all make the hobby. Having said that, there are some people who. Maybe they'll trade, maybe they'll keep one out of the multiple, but they almost in a way want to buy into a player. They I won't say who, but like I know some people who have bought like hundreds of silvers when a player was really low, to try to say, you know what, this is my way of speculating, and I'm just going to, unload this market once this player does really well. And I'm just like, that takes a lot of dedication. That takes a lot of eBay purchases. That takes, unless you're buying it all in one lot from one seller, which I doubt is the case, but people are definitely speculative with the commodity cards. I like to call them commodity cards because they transact almost like stocks. They transact on a daily basis, almost like an hourly basis. When you look up comps for the silver, they're going to be 20 sales every single day versus Allen Houston out of 50 auto from that's not a commodity card, because that card will trade or transact in the public market like twice in a year or something like that.
No, that's exactly right. The commodity, metaphor works here for me in the sense that they're cards that are always going to be moved. They're really well understood, and the pricing's really not that complicated. A lot of the other, fragments of the hobby, it just gets a lot trickier, and so that's why you just see like you can have a really great card, but it's just tough to move because pricing is really hard to sort of find common ground, and you don't have that with these commodity cards. It's pretty well understood.
Yeah. One more card, and then we're going to talk more about his. There's so many things I could talk to you about. Again, this is why I just want to have you on a more regular basis, I think. But his Kaboom card, right? Especially his gold Kaboom, or like it seems like every single one of his. I mean, just recently, news came out that PSA graded one of his Kabooms as a PSA 10, but for a long while, that none were graded more than a PSA 7. It was the Donruss Crown Royale Kaboom, I believe.
Right.
And sorry, we didn't talk about this ahead of time, so you're kind of looking it up right now. Again, he's showing his website, GemRate, and it shows items graded yesterday. I mean, he does this on a daily. It runs.
Well, I was just gonna bring up real quick though the Kaboom stats, because
please.
But in general, I mean, the Kaboom is a perfect example though of a card, which is sort of what the philosophy that I have, which is like people will eventually get over this phenomenon of like grade determines price, and it's more going to be relative to sort of the you said you don't really love the asset conversation, but just like whatever sort of card type you're looking at or sort of specifics you're looking at. And so like with Kabooms, those PSA 8s probably ultimately will be worth just as much as the PSA 10 would in other years, because it's going to be, that one version's probably going to outshine the others pretty massively and be really highly sought after, and have a ridiculous premium assigned to it. But like in general, like those 8s are probably not going to be really massively impacted, and like maybe in the near term there's a little bit of pause of paying so much for a PSA, but that's the reality is that's how the card was printed. And if you like Kabooms and you like Wemby, it's probably what you're going to sort of consider to be, it's not going to say PSA 10 on the label, but it's going to be the highest quality version that exists, with like a very few or rare exceptions in the market. And so it's just really interesting that like you kind of have to think about that and think about not just how the hobby perceives PSA 10s today, which is sort of the rule, and think about what it might look like 20 years from now when there's just a lot of other considerations as it relates to Wemby's market. And so Kaboom is really interesting. That his SI for kids is on this list too. It's number 37. There's been 2,200 of those have been graded. None of them have ever been graded at Gem Mint across any grader. So it's just like it's another fascinating card to think about, like what are people going to be willing to pay? Like people on the market might discount those cards today because they're not gemming, but
Yeah.
they may never gem. And so, like, if you like the card and you like what it stands for, you probably ultimately sort of get to a better price on it over time. But the market might sort of consider it discounted just because it's not considered a gem today.
Yeah. If I make this into short form, as part of our podcast conversation, I actually want to talk about this a little bit, which is I find it fascinating that there's again, this is like maybe apocryphal information or people just kind of like, rumors and myths, but I've heard that the grading companies know that, certain sets may be notorious for a certain way that they were created and so they'll take into consideration the set or the product before they make a grade. Having said that, I don't know if that's really the case because when the comparison I'm going to use is this particular card, Victor Wembanyama Kaboom, and then you have the PMGs, right, from the 90s. And we know that over and over and over again, we see those PMGs created at such low levels. I mean, like, let's say like PSA 6, 7, 8. And again, this Kaboom didn't grade more than a 7 for a long time. And it's really interesting because if you did factor in the condition sensitive or the miscut or the product and the set, shouldn't these grading companies go, yeah, you know what, this set is historically always like this, so we need to take that into consideration and provide better grades than what we're giving them?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely comes into play. That sort of was the debate when this card was initially being graded, was going to be, is PSA just going to consider this to be sort of an off-center standard, right? That makes it, this is how it's printed. We're not going to assume that it was ever printed, or sort of maybe it was even intended to be centered in the way that it typically is. It was just considered, reality was probably an error, sort of some sort of misconsideration in the process. But there was some debate. And then they were like, no, we're going to actually hold it to the centering standards that we have, and we're going to grade these all 7 or 8s. And so, I also have a question, like, where the heck did that one come from then? That is, I brought up in the background here, I brought up the total PSA grading for the Kabooms this year.
Yeah.
And there's been 743 graded, and that one you're discussing is the only gem that's been handed out. And it's like, where did that come from? Like, how's it possible that one of those cards even exists then? It's not like, it's just like, that's why the hobby conspiracy theorists love this stuff, is because it's like, okay, like, did they just have like one sheet that they printed that was actually like before, after the fact? Like, where did that come from? But anyways, ultimately, I do think that's part of what makes this hobby so fun and enjoyable and challenging, is that some of these things change over time too. People will reconsider sets based off of the history of it and say, look, when we first were grading this, we consider these all to be whatever, off-centered, and now we're sort of reconsidered what it means for a Kaboom to come across the desk, 10 years later. I don't think that'll happen with something like Kaboom, but I do think you see that with like sort of lesser, not quite as high profile cards, and that's part of the challenge. That's why I think like things like grader notes are interesting now that they're being made public, or at least being released.
Yes.
To give you some more of an understanding of why things. That's why people liked Beckett for so long, because you at least got some understanding of why a card graded. Right. What it did and like how that might change over time. So anyways, it's highly nuanced, and that's what makes this so interesting. And it's definitely not as scientific as we want it to be. Like, there's definitely changes in ownership could have an impact, or just turnover in graders can have an impact, or just the way the hobby recognizes certain elements and sort of prioritizes certain things could impact it. So you're betting on a lot of different things, and there's no guarantee or certainty of anything in it. And it is inconsistent ultimately too, which is part of the challenge.
The human element of all of this. Corporations are not people, but people are people. And we have people graders. I know I'm not going to get into the whole AI grading. I almost wanted to make a joke about trimming, but I guess I mentioned the word trim, but people don't like when I talk about that, because people just want to like put cover the blanket over their eyes. But yes, it makes me wonder why there is this one, because on your screen right now, you don't only have Wemby, you have Curry, LeBron, Brandon Miller, Luka. I don't even know why Casey Wallace is in here. I know it's because he has Kaboom, but that's crazy that he has a Kaboom. Giannis, Keontae George, same thing. Ant-Man, Asar, and Bilal Coulibaly. Go Wizards. Actually, they're terrible, so it's all right. But out of all those players, all of them, 0 gems for all of them except for 1 for Wemby. So you have down across the board on your chart on the screen right now, a 0 gem rate for all those players that I just mentioned, and then 1 for Wemby. Oh, you got more down here below.
Well,
But
no, yeah, there's more in this, but also the gold's in here too. So it's not
the
just
goal, yeah,
his face.
it's zeros across the board. So, let me ask you a question because you brought a great point about the qualifier with the OC, the off center, because you know I've seen that qualifier on older cards, like a 88, yeah, I think it was a 88 or 89 Fleer Scottie Pippen. Like I used to own it. It was OC, right? It was off centered, but it was a PSA 8 because
Mhm.
everything other than the centering was really good.
Mhm.
I have not seen not just the OC, but like a MC or any. I have not seen any qualifier on any ultra modern card. Have you?
No, they don't. They just ding the card. The challenge is you never knew how it was impacting the grade. Like, was it a massive impact to the grade? Was it marginal impact to the grade? You really had no idea, and so that challenged it. So no, you definitely don't see it anymore. And I'm sort of okay with that, especially like now that graders notes and things like that are becoming more common. But you definitely don't see it in the common in the ultra modern era.
Yeah. No, you just don't see it, and I'm not saying PSA has to bring it back or like all that. I mean, I'm glad that they have greater notes. It's really only for those more expensive cards, the express level and
Right.
above.
For
And
now.
I've only, but it's a step towards the right direction, and it really does make me wonder. Like, again, this is a very special, interesting set. It makes me almost want to do more of a dive, but again, I know a lot of the hobby says don't ask questions, just listen to what you're told, and do as we say, not as we do. This,
One
go
quick
ahead.
note on Kaboom before we move to the next thing is just
Yeah.
one of the more unfortunate things is there was an important point in time when Tracy was really um, public with a lot of the sort of building out of Panini sets, for example. We would talk about here's what the background was, here was some of the inspiration for it, here's sort of what our vision is for it. You hear nothing now of these from these companies. I mean, Topps is
Mm-mm.
doing a better job of that now that they've changed ownership and Fanatics is in place, but Panini, on the other end, has really been quiet for the last, since the pandemic, really, unfortunately. And so you
Yeah.
don't really even hear from them, for example, like, hey, this was our intention, actually, and this is the way the card was always intended to be printed. Like, you'd like to at least have some information of, like, no, this is actually the design. And, like, maybe the market could reflect that. Instead, you hear nothing. And maybe the Kaboom's a tougher example, and maybe it's so high profile that they're afraid to sort of be public on it. But in general, the stories behind the cards are not really well told anymore, and Topps is doing a better job of starting to do that. Upper Deck's kind of pretty quiet too, and so, like, anyways, generally speaking, you don't really get the background, and so you don't really have a lot of information. So it puts the graders in a really weird spot, which is like, hey, maybe we can get a hold of the manufacturer, maybe they'll clue us in, but a lot of times they're probably not even willing to talk to the grading companies because then they got to tell them all the same thing. And
I only have you for 5 to 10 more minutes, and I gotta say, what you said is so in line with what I've been trying to recently say. But for the listeners, when you said the word Tracy, I know who you're talking about. Not that we talked about it beforehand, but I imagine you were talking about Tracy Hackler,
Mhm.
the wonderful, indomitable Tracy Hackler who used to work for Panini, and someone who I would love to get on this podcast. I think maybe before I went a little off script in my Instagram hobby content, it would have been easy for me to get him. But I want to say that communication is so important with these corporations, and these hobby companies can't operate like mom and pop shops or have their heads in the sand like ostriches. They have to actually step up their game, because you see like these airlines, like when people go, oh my gosh, this is terrible, that's terrible, and they put them in the comments, they roast them. They have an actual social media team being like, I'm sorry to hear that, please DM us with more information, we'll try to help you out, we'll try to resolve this issue, because customer retention is so important. We can't stop talking about 10xing the hobby. Let's take care of the customers now, right? If there's someone with a complaint, man, see, this is me getting my soapbox. When people complain, listen to them, make them feel heard, because
Mhm.
people are getting sick and tired of this radio silence. People think that, oh, that's the right PR move to do. Just keep things quiet. It'll sweep it on the rug, and a week later, no one will remember it. Sure,
Right.
maybe the general mass public won't remember it, but the person who bought from you, who liked you, who liked your brand, what you stood for, they're gonna feel not heard, and they're gonna feel like things weren't resolved, and that you're literally ghosting them. I know a lot of these kids nowadays, they ghost each other and all that, but that's
Right.
not an adult thing to do, to ghost someone.
Right.
So again, I'm gonna tone it down a little bit, because once I start doing this, people are gonna start getting on me. But what I want, what you said right now, is so important, because communication is going to improve everything across the board. Like, talk to the public, have the manufacturers talk to the grading companies. Let's have some actual collaboration and like discussions and have it all transparent. Like, maybe that's a dream world and a dream scenario that I'm playing out here, but as customers, as people are paying and who are in this very small niche of a hobby, shouldn't we expect that? Like, don't we deserve that? I know it's a rhetorical.
No, I agree with everything you're saying, and I do think it's the unfortunate sort of outcome of where a lot of the hobby energy goes today, which is sort of towards the short-term benefit of things like breaking and repacks and things that have a lot of energy right now. But I ultimately think like a lot of how this hobby continues to grow, and it doesn't need to multiply every year, but it's sort of how do we just grow it incrementally? And I do think like a lot of it's taken for granted of like the people who actually collect these cards and why they collect these cards and the stories. That's why I said at the beginning of this, like part of the reason GemRate exists, one of the main reasons GemRate exists is to help people tell a better narrative about what they collect and why they collect it. And the hobby companies in general have sort of overlooked that. There's still not a lot of great ways to showcase your cards. Not really a great way to tell a lot of stories around your cards. You know, if it doesn't fit sort of the Instagram brag, then it's not really usually, a focal point. And so I do think that we'll get to a point where people start to understand like, no, we need to do a better job of telling these stories for the people who are in this for the long term and who ultimately are collecting these cards or at least want to participate in a different fashion other than the gambling side of this hobby. So right now there's just a lot of near-term capitalization of sort of like what's working or sort of what's being featured. But yeah, it's kind of being overlooked, and I'd like to think that will change over time. At least I'm cautiously optimistic. That remains to obviously be seen, but it certainly has been understated as it relates to sort of where I think it should be focused, or sort of where sort of the role it can have in the hobby. And I think you're echoing that. So yeah, it's definitely been just not a focal point, unfortunately. And I hope to see that change in the not so distant future.
Cautious optimism. I recently wrote about hope and about how I'm not hobby positive. It's not that I'm not a positive person. It's that I don't want to like dive into toxic positivity. I don't want to feed into everything's wonderful and it's all sunshine and rainbows. And again, like the ostrich with the head in the sand. We have some deep issues and we're not going to get into all of them here. But again, just it's funny because we didn't even, when I talked about the agenda, what we were going to talk about, we had no you can attest to this. I wasn't going to bring up the Crown Royale Kaboom. I didn't even think about it until we were talking about his cards. And so I am generally a positive person. I definitely have my days, but when it comes down to it, it's about the realism of, and you said the narrative, that data is a way to tell a story, right? And so I love what you do for the hobby. Thank you for doing it. I'm going to do my absolute best to push this out because I think what we talked about here in what seems like such a short period, but for someone who's like looking at the thumbnail or looking at how long it was, they're going to be like, oh my gosh, this is like 50 minutes. But I think this is a wonderful discussion. I do think we need to have you back and to talk more about this. There's just so much. We've like scraped just the top.
Mm-hmm.
And Wemby was kind of like the theme. He was kind of like the muse for this episode, but it's almost like it's going to so many other themes within the hobby.
Totally agree. No, I mean, that's one of the reasons I love obviously coming on the show, connecting with you, talking about this stuff, is we always end up going in a direction that I really enjoy, which is sort of, not necessarily the common story being told in the hobby. So no, I appreciate it. Like you said, some of these things we did not discuss at all, but I enjoy because it's just, we could talk for hours, and the Kaboom thing is very interesting, and there's many other topics. But in general, I appreciate you having me on. It was fun to talk about this and just add some context and depth to some of the social stuff, because I really don't do a lot to support it outside of the quick posts that I put out there. So it's always fun going a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I can't believe you said yes. Given all the crazy things that have been going on in my hobby Instagram, I can't believe you said yes.
Oh my God.
Got some people who are like, I'll never talk to you, but remove me from your post. And I'm like, chill, it's not that deep. But it's all good. We're not here to talk about hobby drama. I really appreciate you, Ryan, you and your time. And again, in past episodes, you said that you're bootstrapping this. Like you started all this because you were someone who was curious about grades and like, why did my cards grade the way they did? And you wanted to learn more about grading. It's like, again, just that natural curiosity. And I really appreciate that about you. And I think that's why we get along so well. And I hope people could hear and see that, you know, kind of like, I don't know, organic chemistry that we have with kind of having a conversation and just having people listen in on it. So I really appreciate you. Hope you have a wonderful just day and, you know, time in the hobby. And till next time, because I can't wait for the next time, because we're going to be talking about some more stuff for sure.
Thanks, Daniel. I always appreciate it.
All right. Take care. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.